Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into a topic that's truly shaping our world, not just for tech insiders, but really for all of us. It's the fascinating, often challenging realm of AI ethics and bias. You've sent us a fantastic stack of sources, everything from, deep academic papers to corporate promises and actual global rules being written. Our mission, to cut through the noise, sift through these sources, and hand you the essential insights. We'll explore what it really means for AI to be ethical, how these hidden biases can creep into powerful systems.
Which happens more than you might think.
Exactly. And the very real harm they can cause in our daily lives, and importantly, what the world is actually doing about it.
What's truly striking looking at these materials is how fast this whole conversation has moved. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that AI ethics was, well, a pretty niche academic discussion. Now, though, as AI influences critical decisions in healthcare, finance, even criminal justice, it's become a global imperative. We're talking about fundamental shifts in society here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important we unpack this. We're going to explore how AI, which, many people assume is perfectly objective.
Right, like it's just math.
Can actually absorb, reflect, and sometimes even, amplify existing real-world inequalities. Get ready for some eye-opening moments, maybe some aha moments that will leave you feeling truly well-informed on this crucial subject. Okay, so to get us started, let's maybe lay the groundwork a bit. What exactly do we mean by AI ethics, and why is it suddenly such a, sort of burning issue right now?
Well, according to the materials you shared, AI ethics isn't just some vague concept. It's actually defined as a concrete set of values, principles, and even specific techniques that guide how we approach AI, and that's throughout its entire lifespan. So from the very first design sketch all the way to deployment and ongoing use.
Right.
The core idea really is ensuring AI benefits humanity, doesn't harm it. The stakes are incredibly high because, frankly, without these guardrails, AI could unintentionally become a force that deepens historical inequalities. Some researchers, I noticed, even call it a super disruptive technology.
Wow, super disruptive. That tells you a lot about the potential impact.
Yeah.
So, given these high stakes, is there any kind of shared understanding globally on what these ethical principles should be, or is just everyone doing their own thing?
What's remarkable, actually, and it's a consistent theme across our sources, is that a global consensus is emerging, at least on the high-level principles.
Really? Like what?
Well, the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence, for example, that stands out. It's the very first global standard, and it's rooted in pretty universal values like human rights, dignity, diversity. And from those values, it outlines principles like proportionality and do no harm, fairness and non-discrimination, human oversight, and crucially, transparency and explainability.
Interesting. So it's not just UNESCO then. Is this consensus kind of echoed elsewhere?
Absolutely. Yeah, you see these same core ideas reflected in philosophical frameworks, like Luciano Floridi's 5 principles: beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, justice, and explicability. And even, major corporations like SAP. Their pledges emphasize human well-being, keeping a human in the loop, mitigating bias. The vocabulary is strikingly consistent across the board. Fairness, accountability, transparency, human oversight, those words keep coming up.
Okay, so that what seems largely agreed upon, at least in broad strokes. But that brings us to the really tricky part, the how. How do we actually implement these ideals? How do we make them real?
That's precisely where the tension lies, and our sources really, really highlight this. While there's this broad agreement on the high-level principles, there's significant disagreement, even conflict, on how to implement and enforce them.
Right.
And this gap is really clear when you look at different regulatory philosophies. For instance, you've got the legally binding framework being adopted in the EU.
Which we'll get into.
Exactly. Compared to the more voluntary sort of guidance-based approach currently favored in the U.S., this fundamental difference in approach, this tension, is really going to define the future of AI ethics globally.
Okay. Now, within those universal principles you mentioned, our sources keep circling back to a foundational trio: fairness, accountability, and transparency, often called FAT, right?
Yep, FAT.
Could you break down why these three are just so crucial for building AI we can actually trust?
You bet. Think of them as the absolute pillars. First, fairness. It's about ensuring impartial and just treatment. That means designing systems that act equitably for everyone and actively preventing adverse effects on individuals or groups, especially based on things like race or gender, protected characteristics. Ultimately, it's about correcting algorithmic bias.
Okay, makes sense. Then accountability.
Accountability. This means that if an AI system causes harm, someone, whether it's a developer, a company, an organization, is responsible. It demands clear oversight, unambiguous lines of liability. Basically, consequences.
So there's redress for people affected.
Exactly. It gives those ethical principles their teeth. Without it, they're just nice words.
And the third one, transparency.
Transparency. This goes hand in hand with explainability. It's about making the how and why of an AI system visible, understandable. That includes explaining its logic, the data it used, everything. And it's really a prerequisite for both fairness and accountability. You can't judge if a system is fair or hold someone accountable if you don't understand how it reached its decision. It's fundamental.
Okay, here's where it gets, I think, really interesting. The sources suggest this isn't just about abstract moral guidelines anymore. It seems to be rapidly becoming a core component of organizational risk management.
That's a critical shift, absolutely. You see it clearly in frameworks from NIST, that's the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US,
Right.
and even from big consultancies like Deloitte. They're explicitly using the language of risk management. And when you look at something like the EU AI Act, well, it codifies severe financial penalties for violations.
Serious money, right?
We're talking up to 7% of a company's global annual turnover. That's a huge signal. This isn't just about doing the right thing anymore. It's moving squarely into essential business functions like compliance and legal risk.
But this operationalization, this move to make ethics more concrete, maybe more about rules and penalties, it also introduces attention, doesn't it? Is there a risk that ethical AI just becomes a compliance checkbox exercise?
It's a very real concern, and it comes up in our sources. There's a definite danger that ethics could be reduced to merely fulfilling legal requirements, ticking the boxes, without genuinely tackling the deeper, maybe novel or not yet codified ethical challenges that AI constantly throws up. The primary driver for an organization might become avoiding liability, mitigating that financial risk, rather than cultivating genuine moral responsibility.
Okay, so let's pivot slightly and get into the heart of a major problem we've touched on. Bias. AI is often sold as being objective, purely logical. So where does this bias actually come from? It seems counterintuitive.
That's such a crucial question, and the sources are very, very clear on this. AI bias isn't some rare technical glitch. It's a pervasive systemic challenge. It emerges because AI systems fundamentally learn from data.
Right, the data they're fed.
Exactly. And that data is a product of our world, a world that's frankly full of historical inequalities and all sorts of human cognitive biases. So an AI often acts like a mirror, just reflecting these societal biases back at us. But here's the insidious part, the real danger. It can also amplify and automate those biases at a scale and speed humans simply cannot. It scales up the problem.
That makes perfect sense when you put it like that. Can you walk us through some of the key places this bias can actually creep in during an AI's life cycle? Where does it originate?
Yeah, the sources trace bias to several key points, sort of vulnerabilities in the process. First, and often the biggest culprit, is data bias. This happens when the training data itself is flawed. Well, imagine a facial recognition system trained mostly on pictures of people with lighter skin tones. It's naturally going to struggle, maybe fail, when it encounters darker complexions. That's non-representative data. Or you have historical bias, where the data reflects past prejudices like old hiring records, which the AI then learns and perpetuates as if it's normal. Even the humans labeling the data, the annotators, can unconsciously introduce their own biases during that process. Or sampling bias, where the data just isn't representative of the people that AI will actually interact with.
Okay, so data is a huge one. What else?
Second, there's algorithmic bias. This is trickier. Even if your data was magically perfect, which it never is,
Right.
the way the algorithm itself is designed, or maybe the parameters chosen by the developers, or even their own unconscious cognitive bias, and it favor certain outcomes over others. It's much harder to spot.
And the third.
Human and user bias. This isn't just about data labeling, though that's part of it. It also includes something called automation bias. It's that very human tendency to overtrust automated systems. So if a biased AI produces an output and a human user just accepts it without scrutiny, maybe because they assume the computer knows best.
You create this dangerous feedback loop.
Exactly. The bias gets reinforced and potentially even worse over time.
Our sources also provide a kind of taxonomy, different specific types of bias. Are there any particular ones that might surprise people beyond those general categories?
Absolutely. Yeah, digging into the specific types really illuminates the problem more clearly. There's historical bias, which we touched on. That's where the training data literally reflects societal prejudices from the past, maybe decades ago. The model learns this injustice as fact.
So it keeps old problems alive.
Precisely. Then there's label bias. This one's subtle. It's introduced by inconsistent or subjective human annotators when they're labeling the data. If different people label the same thing differently based on their own perceptions or biases, the model learns that inconsistency. There's also confirmation bias. You know how we humans tend to notice and favor information that confirms what we already believe?
Sure.
Well, AI models can exhibit a similar tendency, favoring data or patterns that reinforce what they've already learned, making it harder for them to recognize and correct their own biases.
And you mentioned one specific to generative AI.
Yes, generative bias. This is really relevant now with things like ChatGPT and image generators. It's when the outputs themselves contain unbalanced or stereotypical representations because of the biases embedded in the absolutely vast data sets they were trained on. For instance, if you ask an AI image generator for a picture of a CEO and it overwhelmingly produces images of white men, that's generative bias in action. It's reflecting the biases in the data it learned from.
This is where it gets really concrete and, frankly, quite concerning. Our sources provide several case studies showing how AI bias manifests as tangible harm in the real world, often in really high-stakes sectors. What stands out to you from these examples? What patterns emerge?
If we zoom out and connect the dots here, these cases reveal a really consistent and disturbing pattern. AI systems are often perpetuating and even amplifying existing societal inequalities.
Okay, like in what areas?
Well, take hiring and employment. The infamous Amazon AI recruiting tool from, I think it was 2014 to 2018 is a classic example. It learned from years of historical resumes that male candidates were preferred. So it started penalizing resumes that included words like women's, as in women's chess club captain.
Precisely.
Yes, and it downgraded graduates from 2 specific all-women's colleges. Amazon eventually had to scrap the whole thing. That's textbook historical bias. Or consider Google's advertising system. Studies found it was showing ads for high-paying jobs more often to men than to equally qualified women. And then there's the case of HireView's video interview analysis software, which reportedly failed a deaf and indigenous woman because its underlying model apparently wasn't trained on inputs like hers sign language or certain facial expressions.
Wow. Okay, what about the criminal justice system? That seems like a particularly high-stakes area.
Absolutely. The sources highlight the COMPAS algorithm, which has been used in U.S. courts to predict the risk of someone reoffending. ProPublica did a big investigation back in 2016 and found it was almost twice as likely to incorrectly label Black defendants as high risk compared to white defendants, even when other factors were similar.
That's deeply concerning.
It is. Or think about predictive policing algorithms. These are often trained on historical arrest data. But if that data already reflects biased policing practices,
Then the algorithm just sends police back to the same over-policed, often minority neighborhoods.
exactly. It creates a feedback loop that reinforces existing biases. And tragically, facial recognition technology. It's well documented that it still has significantly higher error rates for people of color, particularly Black women, and also for women generally, and older individuals. This isn't just theoretical, it's led to documented wrongful arrests, like the case of Portia Woodruff, a pregnant Black woman in Detroit who was misidentified.
Unbelievable. What about finance? Money's always a sensitive area.
Yes, finance too. Remember the Apple Card controversy a few years back? Accusations flew about gender bias when some men received credit limits up to 20 times higher than their wives, even with shared assets.
I do remember that.
And more recently, studies looking at large language models, or LLMs, being used for mortgage underwriting, found they were consistently denying more loans or charging significantly higher interest rates to Black and Hispanic applicants compared to white applicants with similar financial profiles. It's essentially creating a modern digital form of redlining.
And healthcare. That seems like another area where bias could have terrible consequences.
Definitely. One really stark example from the sources involved a widely used commercial algorithm in U.S. hospitals. Its job was to identify high-risk patients who might need extra care management, but it turned out to be dramatically biased against Black patients.
How? What was it looking at?
It used past healthcare costs as a proxy, as a stand-in for healthcare need. The assumption was higher costs means sicker patients.
Okay, that sounds logical on the surface.
But Due to long-standing systemic inequalities in access to care and insurance, Black patients historically generated lower healthcare costs for the same level of sickness compared to white patients.
Ah, I see. So the algorithm.
Systematically underestimated their actual health needs. By more than half, according to the study. It meant they were far less likely to be flagged for extra help, even when they were just as sick.
That healthcare example really highlights what our sources call the insidious proxy problem, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The AI wasn't explicitly told, be biased against Black patients. It wasn't looking at race directly.
Exactly.
But it used a variable healthcare cost that seemed neutral, but was actually deeply correlated with race due to those systemic societal issues.
Precisely. And this drives home such a critical point. Simply removing a race column or any protected characteristic from your dataset won't magically fix the problem. The bias can still be encoded, hidden within other seemingly innocent variables that act as proxies.
Like zip codes sometimes.
Zip codes, income levels, past purchasing behavior, lots of things can be proxies. And the sources really emphasize that this demonstrates the limitations of trying to achieve fairness through unawareness just by blinding the AI to certain attributes. It underscores the absolute necessity of transparency of XAI to truly understand why a model is making the decisions it does to uncover these hidden correlations.
So stepping back, what does this all mean for us? For society, for individuals interacting with these systems every single day?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, these case studies, they aren't just isolated incidents or random technical errors. They reveal that AI bias is a compounding systemic risk. It disproportionately harms individuals and groups who are already marginalized in society. It often acts as an accelerant for inequality, effectively digitizing and scaling up historical prejudices at an unprecedented rate.
So debiasing AI isn't just fixing a technical bug.
Not at all. It's an attempt to counteract deeply embedded societal patterns that the AI has learned. It's fundamentally a socio-technical problem. It requires far more than just tweaking the code. It requires addressing the societal roots, too.
Right. Okay. Given all these really significant challenges, it's clear the world can't just stand by and let this happen. So how are governments and organizations globally trying to establish frameworks for governing AI and mitigating these harms? It sounds like a pretty complex global puzzle.
It truly is. Yeah, our sources show this fascinating kind of messy patchwork of diverging national and regional approaches, and each one reflects different legal traditions, different political philosophies, different priorities.
So what are the main players? The EU seems to be a big one.
Definitely. The EU AI Act is arguably the most assertive, most comprehensive, and it's legally binding. That's key. It uses a risk-based approach, categorizing AI systems into 4 tiers.
Okay, what are those?
Tier 1 is unacceptable risk. These are outright banned. Things like government-run social scoring systems or AI designed for manipulative subliminal techniques. Tier 2 is high risk. These are heavily regulated. Think AI in critical infrastructure, medical devices, employment decisions, law enforcement, migration control.
The really sensitive stuff.
Exactly. These systems face strict requirements. Robust risk management, high-quality data, human oversight, detailed documentation, transparency. Tier 3 is limited risk. These mainly just require transparency. So a chatbot has to tell you you're interacting with an AI, deepfakes need to be labeled. And Tier 4 is minimal risk. Things like spam filters or AI in video games. No new obligations for these under the Act.
What about things like ChatGPT, general models?
Right. It also has specific rules for general purpose AI or GPAI, models like LLMs that can do many things. There are baseline transparency requirements for all GPAI, and then more stringent obligations for models deemed to pose systemic risk, usually based on their sheer computational power or reach. And its enforcement mechanism is robust, those huge fines we mentioned, and it has extraterritorial scope, meaning it applies to companies outside the EU if they offer services within the EU.
Okay, so that's the EU's strong approach.
Mhm.
What about the United States? You said it's different.
Very different. The United States currently has a much more flexible non-regulatory approach, sector-specific. The centerpiece right now is the NIST AI Risk Management Framework, or AI-RMF. It's essentially a voluntary guidance document published by the government's standards agency.
Voluntary. Okay.
Yes. It's structured around 4 functions: govern, map, measure, and manage. It's designed to help organizations identify and handle AI risks without the argument goes, stifling innovation. It defines trustworthy AI with 7 characteristics, including fairness, transparency, accountability, those core principles again, but enforcement. It largely relies on existing regulatory agencies applying their current sector-specific rules, like the FTC for consumer protection or the EEOC for employment discrimination. There's no single overarching AI law like in the EU.
And the UK. Are they following the EU or the US?
The UK is trying to carve out its own path, aiming for a pro-innovation, light-touch stance, at least for now. They've explicitly rejected a single overarching AI law like the EU's. Instead, they've eschewed 5 cross-sectoral principles: safety, transparency, fairness, accountability, contestability, intended to guide existing regulators like Ofcom or the CMA.
So empowering current watchdogs rather than creating a new one.
Initially, yes. However, there's definitely growing pressure, including from Parliament, for more formal oversight. We're seeing proposals like the Artificial Intelligence Regulation Bill, which aims to create a central AI authority after all. So the UK approach might still evolve.
Interesting. What about Canada? I remember hearing something about their plans.
Canada provides a really interesting cautionary tale, actually. Their proposed Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, or AA, initially aimed for a risk-based framework somewhat similar to the EU's, but it ultimately failed to pass or stalled largely due to widespread criticism from civil society groups and experts.
Why? What were the criticisms?
They argued the requirements were too vague, enforcement mechanisms were weak, and crucially that it didn't offer sufficient human rights protections. It really demonstrates that the process of creating AI regulation involving stakeholders, being clear, addressing fundamental rights, is just as critical as the final content of the law.
Good point. And China. They always have a distinct approach.
Absolutely. China has moved very aggressively, but with targeted, often industry-specific regulations. Their focus is heavily weighted towards content control and information management. For example, new rules mandate explicit and sometimes implicit labeling of AI-generated content. There are significant restrictions on services deemed to have public opinion attributes or social mobilization capacity. It's a very state-centric approach, clearly prioritizing social stability and state control over the kind of individual fundamental rights emphasized in, say, the EU framework.
So it's definitely not a unified global front. It's more like regulatory blocks forming. This brings us back to that enduring debate: formal government regulation versus industry-led standards. What are the core trade-offs our sources highlight here?
Yeah, the sources lay it out pretty clearly. Government regulation offers enforceability. It sets a mandatory baseline that everyone has to meet. That's a big plus for ensuring basic protections. But the downside is that it can be slow to create, slow to adapt to rapid technological change, and potentially stifle innovation if it's too rigid.
Okay, and industry standards.
Industry standards are typically much more flexible, faster to develop, and can really foster the adoption of best practices within specific sectors. The main drawback, of course, is that they're usually voluntary. They lack the legal teeth of government regulation. Companies can choose whether or not to follow them.
Right. That's a clear distinction. Now, what's particularly interesting from our sources is this idea you mentioned earlier, a potential Brussels effect in AI. Can you unpack that a bit more? What exactly does that mean?
It's a fascinating concept. The Brussels effect basically suggests that because the EU's AI Act is so comprehensive, legally binding, and has that extraterritorial reach we talked about,
Right, affecting companies globally.
it could effectively set a de facto global benchmark. The thinking is that many multinational companies will find it easier to just align all their global operations with the stricter EU standards rather than managing different compliance regimes. So theoretically, the EU's higher standards for things like transparency and safety could spill over and influence practices worldwide, even in places without similar laws.
So the EU sets the standard, everyone else follows.
That's the theory. However, our sources also add a crucial caveat. The existence of powerful alternative models, the U.S.'s market-driven voluntary approach, and China's state-controlled model suggest we might end up with a more multipolar regulatory world. Companies might actually have to geofence their AI models, meaning they might deploy different versions of the same AI system with different features or safeguards specifically tailored to comply with the rules in different regulatory blocks, one version for the EU, one for the U.S., one for China, etc. It complicates things significantly.
Definitely sounds complicated. Okay, let's shift focus from governments to the corporations themselves. Our sources detail how many major tech players, Google, Microsoft, Meta, IBM, have publicized their own internal AI ethics principles. What do their frameworks actually look like on the ground? Are they all the same?
They largely show a strong convergence with that global consensus on principles we discussed earlier. Fairness, accountability, transparency are usually prominent. But there are nuances. Google's approach, for instance, emphasizes responsible development, mitigating bias, promoting privacy. It aligns pretty well with the NIST framework. What's particularly notable, though, and mentioned in the sources, is their controversial updated guidelines from 2025. They apparently now allow AI applications in weapons and surveillance, albeit under strict oversight, which was a reversal of their previous public policy.
That's significant. What about Microsoft?
Microsoft builds its framework on 6 core principles: fairness, reliability and safety, privacy and security, inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability. Pretty standard stuff. But they've gone further in operationalizing it, developing a detailed responsible AI standard for their internal teams and creating practical tools like their responsible AI dashboard and something called the Human AI Experience, HAX workbook, to guide developers.
And Meta, Facebook's parent company. You mentioned they have a unique approach.
Yeah, Meta's approach stands out because of its strong public commitment to open science. They've open sourced their powerful Llama large language models. Their argument is that democratizing access like this actually accelerates innovation and safety identification because a wider global community can scrutinize the models, find flaws, and build on them.
So more eyes make it safer.
That's the argument. Their ethical considerations generally mirror industry standards, fairness, safety, etc., and they publish a responsible use guide for people using their open models. But the openness itself is the distinguishing philosophy.
And IBM, they've been in the AI game a long time.
IBM, with its dedicated AI ethics board, really seems to focus on practical implementation and governance. Their core tenets are often stated as, AI should augment human intelligence, not replace it. Data and insights belong to their creator, not the AI company. And new technology, including AI, must be transparent and explainable. They put a big emphasis on trust.
This comparison really does surface a kind of philosophical divergence, doesn't it? Especially with Meta's very open approach versus the others.
Indeed, Meta's open strategy stands in quite stark contrast to the more traditionally closed proprietary ecosystems you see from Google, Microsoft, and IBM with their flagship models.
What are the implications of that split?
Well, the open approach, like Meta's, certainly carries risks of misuse by malicious actors, people using powerful open models for harmful purposes. That's the big concern. But as Meta argues, it also potentially enables broader, faster, community-driven safety research and innovation and prevents power concentration. The closed approach offers the companies greater control over development and deployment, potentially making it easier to enforce safety standards internally. But it risks concentrating immense power in a few hands and creating opaque black box systems that are harder for outsiders to examine or hold accountable.
So it's a real trade-off.
Yeah.
Which philosophy proves more effective and beneficial in the long run?
Is a huge open question. The long-term impact will be fascinating and maybe crucial to watch.
Okay. Now, despite all these high-level principles, government frameworks, corporate pledges, our sources still highlight a persistent, maybe frustrating, implementation gap. Why do ethical failures, and specifically biases like the ones we discussed, keep happening? It feels like we know the problems but aren't always fixing them.
It really is frustrating, and research from places like Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered AI, or HAI, points to several critical, often overlapping factors. First, there are immense institutional challenges. Just embedding ethics effectively into the culture and workflow of fast-paced, metric-driven tech companies is incredibly hard.
The pressure to ship products quickly.
Exactly. The intense pressure to innovate and deploy quickly can easily deprioritize the time, resources, and sometimes difficult conversations needed for thorough bias testing and deep ethical review. Move fast and break things doesn't always mesh well with do no harm. Second, a persistent lack of diversity in AI development teams remains a huge blind spot, if the people building the AI predominantly come from similar backgrounds.
They might not anticipate or even recognize the potential negative impacts on different underrepresented groups.
Precisely. Homogeneous teams often lack a lived experience and diverse perspectives needed to build truly inclusive and equitable systems. And finally, the relative absence, still, of strong, comprehensive external regulation in many places means that corporate AI ethics initiatives can sometimes remain more of a public relations function or a voluntary guideline, rather than a core legally mandated business requirement with real teeth.
Right. So given those challenges, what are companies actually doing internally to try and bridge this gap? How are they trying to make ethics more than just a statement on their website?
They are trying to formalize internal governance mechanisms, as their sources show. It's becoming more structured. Many are establishing dedicated AI ethics boards or steering committees, like IBM's we mentioned. These aim to provide centralized oversight, policy guidance, and review capabilities. Ideally, they have diverse compositions, engineers, ethicists, lawyers, social scientists, and very clear missions.
Okay, boards and committees. What else?
They're increasingly conducting formal ethical audits and impact assessments. This means proactively identifying potential ethical risks and societal impacts before deploying a system and then monitoring it after deployment. This involves evaluating the data for bias, testing the model's outputs for disparate impacts on different groups, ensuring transparency mechanisms are working, and setting up processes for continuous monitoring. UNESCO, for instance, strongly promotes these ethical impact assessments as a best practice.
And you mentioned red teaming earlier. How does that fit in?
Yes, red teaming. This is becoming a crucial safety procedure, especially for the most powerful, cutting-edge frontier models. It's essentially an adversarial testing approach. Dedicated internal or sometimes external teams intentionally try to break the AI, make it fail, produce harmful outputs, reveal biases, generate unsafe content.
Like ethical hacking, but for AI safety.
Kind of, yeah. The goal is to proactively discover vulnerabilities and failure modes before the system is released to the public so they can be fixed. Companies like Google and Meta are using this extensively as part of their safety protocols for new large models.
Okay, so that's the internal governance. Beyond that, our sources describe a whole toolkit of mitigation strategies, covering both technical fixes and organizational changes. Let's start with the technical side. We talked about bias originating in data and algorithms. Can we actually code fairness into an AI system? What tools are available?
This is where that specialized subfield we touched on, fairness-aware machine learning, or FML, comes in. It's all about designing algorithms and techniques specifically to detect, quantify, and then mitigate unfair bias in AI models. They generally use three main types of approaches, depending on when in the life cycle you intervene. First is pre-processing. This is about trying to fix the bias in the data before you even start training the model.
How do you do that?
Techniques include things like resampling the data to ensure underrepresented groups are adequately reflected, or reweighting data points so the model pays more attention to minority groups during learning. Essentially, cleaning the data first.
Okay, then.
Second is in-processing. This involves modifying the learning algorithm itself during the training phase. You basically add mathematical fairness constraints to the model's learning objective. So the model isn't just trying to be accurate, it's also being explicitly penalized if it produces biased outcomes for different groups. It tries to learn fairness while learning the task.
And the fourth approach?
Post-processing. This happens after the model has already been trained. You take the model's raw predictions and adjust them slightly to improve fairness across groups, maybe by setting different decision thresholds for different populations.
So intervening before, during, or after training.
Exactly. Each has its pros and cons, and often a combination is needed.
And then there's explainable AI, or XAI, which you mentioned is crucial for transparency. Why is that considered a mitigation tool as well? How does explaining help fix bias?
XAI is absolutely vital because making these complex, often black box AI decisions understandable to humans is essential for several reasons tied to mitigation. First, it helps with debugging. If you can understand why a model made a weird or biased decision, you can pinpoint the cause, maybe flawed data, maybe an algorithmic issue, and fix it. Second, it helps identify hidden biases that simple performance metrics might miss. An explanation might reveal the model is relying on a problematic proxy variable, for instance.
Oh, like the healthcare cost example.
Exactly. Third, it builds trust. Users are more likely to trust and use AI responsibly if they have some understanding of how it works. And fourth, it enables meaningful accountability and oversight. You can't really hold a system accountable if its reasoning is completely opaque.
So what do these XAI methods actually look like? How do you explain a complex model?
There's a growing range of techniques. Some involve using simpler, intrinsically interpretable models from the start, like basic decision trees or linear regression, though these often sacrifice some accuracy. More common for complex models are post hoc explanation techniques. Tools like LIME, local interpretable model agnostic explanations,
Catchy name.
and S-shapely additive explanations. These work by analyzing how the model's output changes when you tweak the inputs for a specific decision. They can essentially tell you, for this particular prediction, these were the most important features the AI considered, and this is how much they contributed. It gives you a local, specific insight. There are also visualization-based approaches, like saliency maps for image recognition, which highlight the pixels the AI focused on most.
And are these just academic tools or are companies using them?
Oh, they're definitely moving into practice. Major tech companies have even developed and open-sourced practical toolkits to help developers implement fairness and explainability. IBM has its AI Fairness 360 toolkit, Microsoft has fairlearn.p, and Google has the What If tool for model exploration and understanding, so the tools are becoming more accessible.
Okay, so we have FAML techniques, we have XAI tools. This raises a really important question, maybe the crux of it. Does this mean we can just code fairness into an AI system?
Right.
Can we engineer away the ethical problem?
That's such a critical question, and it leads to a truly fascinating, maybe counterintuitive finding from the research in FAML. It's a big aha moment when you grasp it. The answer seems to be no, not entirely. Fairness itself is not a single technically achievable goal that you can just program in perfectly.
What do you mean isn't fairness? Fairness.
Well, researchers have actually defined over 20 different mathematical statistical criteria for measuring group fairness in AI models. Things like demographic parity, equalized odds, equal opportunity.
Okay, lots of definitions.
Right. But here's the kicker. Mathematical impossibility theorems have actually proven that it's often literally impossible for a single AI model to satisfy several of these key desirable fairness criteria simultaneously, especially when the underlying base rates or outcome rates naturally differ between groups in the real world.
Wait, it's mathematically impossible to satisfy multiple types of fairness at once?
Often, yes. You face unavoidable trade-offs. Optimizing for one definition of fairness might necessarily violate another definition. So what this means is that developers and organizations must make a choice. They have to decide which definition of fairness to prioritize for their specific application and context. And crucially, that choice isn't purely a technical one. It's a normative, social, ethical, even political decision about what kind of fairness matters most in that situation.
Wow. So you can't just tell the engineers, make it fair. You have to tell them what kind of fair.
Exactly. It fundamentally challenges the whole notion that ethics can be perfectly coded into a system or that technology alone can solve these deep societal issues. The human element, the value judgments, are inescapable.
That's a really profound point. So if technical solutions alone aren't enough, it brings us back to the human and organizational side. It's not just about the code, it's about the humans building and governing the AI. What are the key organizational interventions beyond the technical tools that our sources highlight as essential?
Absolutely. Our sources strongly, repeatedly emphasize that technical solutions alone are insufficient. You need the organizational and human pieces, too. One recurring, almost constant theme is the critical role of diverse teams.
We talked about this as a cause of bias.
Right. And conversely, diversity is key to the solution. A lack of diversity in development teams creates blind spots. Teams that encompass various backgrounds, gender, ethnicity, disciplines, socioeconomic status, abilities, lived experiences, much wider perspectives. These diverse perspectives are crucial for identifying potential biases early, anticipating unintended consequences for different groups, and ultimately designing more inclusive and equitable solutions. It's not just nice to have, it's essential for good AI.
Makes sense. What else?
Human in the loop and meaningful oversight. Maintaining human oversight in AI decision-making, especially in high-stakes domains, is foundational. Humans provide context, common sense, empathy, and ethical judgment that machines currently lack.
But it has to be meaningful oversight, right? Not just rubber stamping.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's the key word the sources use, meaningful. For oversight to be meaningful, the human overseer needs sufficient AI literacy to understand the system's capabilities and limitations. They need the time and authority to intervene. And they need tools, like XAI, to genuinely understand the AI's decision-making process. Just having a human click approve on an AI recommendation without understanding why isn't meaningful oversight. It might just diffuse responsibility.
Good point. And the third key organizational piece.
Ethical audits and continuous monitoring. We mentioned audits earlier in governance, but they're also a core mitigation strategy. This means having formal, regular, and ideally independent auditing processes in place. This could involve dedicated internal ethics review boards, using external auditors for high-risk systems, defining clear metrics to track fairness and ethical performance over time, and crucially, committing to continuous monitoring throughout the system's entire lifecycle. AI models aren't static. They can experience model drift as the real-world data changes, and new biases or ethical issues can emerge over time. You need ongoing vigilance.
Okay, so it's a combination of better tech, diverse teams, meaningful human oversight, and continuous auditing. That's a whole ecosystem.
It really is. It's a socio-technical system, and you need to address all parts of it.
Now, as AI continues to advance at, frankly, breakneck speed, the ethical landscape is constantly shifting under our feet. Our sources highlight two major frontier challenges that are really pushing the boundaries of our current ethical frameworks and mitigation strategies. First, the one everyone's talking about, the ethical quagmire of generative AI. How has this explosion in capability, things like large language models, image generators, changed the game for ethics and bias?
It's truly profound, and it's shifted the conversation significantly. While generative AI, of course, still suffers from the familiar data-driven biases we've discussed, like generating stereotypical images or text reflecting societal bias.
Like the CEO example.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It also introduces fundamentally new vectors of harm that go beyond just making discriminatory decisions about individuals. The potential harms are different in kind.
Like what? What are these new harms?
Well, first and foremost, misinformation and disinformation at scale. Generative AI makes it incredibly trivially easy to create highly realistic deepfakes, fake text, fake images, fake audio, fake video that are increasingly hard to distinguish from reality. This poses an immense threat to our information ecosystem, potentially polluting public discourse, eroding trust in institutions and media, and enabling malicious influence campaigns on an unprecedented scale.
That's scary. What else?
Copyright, authorship, and intellectual property. This is huge. These models are trained on literally billions of text and image data points scraped from the internet, much of which is copyrighted material, often ingested without the creator's consent or compensation.
Leading to lawsuits, right?
Big ones. Getty Images, authors, artists are suing AI companies. It raises profound questions. Who is the creator of AI-generated content? Can AI output be copyrighted? The U.S. Copyright Office has initially said works created solely by AI can't be copyrighted, but it's a fiercely contested legal and philosophical battleground.
Okay, misinfo, copyright, anything else?
Yeah.
Yes, labor exploitation and the devaluation of creativity. It's a hidden ethical dilemma often overlooked. Building these massive models, especially making them safer, relies on a large, often invisible workforce of low-wage contract workers around the world doing difficult data labeling and content filtering tasks, often facing precarious conditions and potential psychological harm. And of course, there's widespread concern, particularly in creative industries, writing, art, music, coding, about generative AI potentially displacing human workers or devaluing human creativity and expertise.
And the environmental costs.
Right, the environmental impact. Training and even just running these enormous generative models requires staggering amounts of computational power, which translates into massive energy consumption and significant water usage for cooling data centers. This leads to substantial carbon footprints, creating another complex ethical trade-off between the benefits of AI and its environmental cost.
Wow, so the harms are broader than just biased decisions. And then there's that specific issue you mentioned earlier, amplified by generative AI, its tendency to hallucinate. That word alone sounds like a major red flag.
It is, and it's deeply troubling from an ethical and societal perspective. Hallucination means these generative models produce outputs that sound plausible, confident, maybe even authoritative, but are entirely fabricated.
They just make stuff up.
Yes, they might invent facts, create fake citations for academic papers, misattribute quotes, because fundamentally they are incredibly sophisticated pattern-matching machines, probabilistic engines predicting the next likely word or pixel. They are not systems of knowledge retrieval or reasoning.
They don't actually know things.
They don't possess a concept of truth or falsity in the human sense. They're just generating statistically probable sequences based on their training data. And this poses a profound epistemic threat, a threat to our knowledge and our ability to determine what's real. It risks eroding our collective ability to distinguish fact from fiction, especially as these models become more integrated into search engines and information tools.
So the ethical focus shifts.
Exactly. It shifts from just worrying about discriminatory decisions affecting individuals to worrying about the potential corruption of the entire information ecosystem and our shared basis for reality.
That's a heavy thought. Okay, what's the second major frontier challenge our sources highlight?
Beyond generative AI. The second major frontier challenge is the increasing development and deployment of autonomous systems, particularly those that operate in the physical world with little or no direct human input or control in real time. These systems think advanced robotics, self-driving vehicles, certain types of drones raise some of the most profound questions about accountability, responsibility, trust, and the appropriate limits of delegating decisions, sometimes life-altering decisions, to machines.
We talked about self-driving cars earlier, and the accidents. That seems like a prime example.
It is. Self-driving cars crystallize the core ethical challenge. How do you ensure these systems operate safely and reliably and align with human values when they have to make independent decisions in complex, unpredictable, open-ended, real-world situations? A central, perhaps intractable problem here is the accountability gap. If an autonomous system like a self-driving car causes harm, an accident, an injury, a death, the lines of responsibility can become incredibly blurred.
Who is to blame?
Exactly. Is it the owner who was supposed to be supervising? Is it the manufacturer of the car? Is it the company that wrote the software? The company that made the sensors? Or, controversially, is the AI itself somehow responsible? Our existing legal and moral frameworks are fundamentally built around the idea of human agency and intent. Autonomous systems challenge this foundation, creating a potential vacuum where serious harm can occur without clear legal or moral accountability. The fatal self-driving Uber accident in Arizona a few years ago really brought this into sharp focus.
But the ultimate red line, the most extreme version of this autonomy challenge, as our sources put it, seems to be lethal autonomous weapon systems, or laws, often chillingly referred to as killer robots.
Yes. This is where the debate over autonomy reaches its most critical, most morally charged, and frankly most terrifying point. Laws are defined as weapon systems that can independently search for, identify, target, and use lethal force against human beings without any further direct human intervention or control once activated.
So the machine makes the final kill decision on its own.
Correct. And there's a large and growing international coalition of NGOs, scientists, ethicists, and even some governments who view the development and deployment of such weapons as crossing a fundamental moral red line. They see it as an existential threat to humanity.
What are the core ethical objections to laws that our sources lay out? Why is this considered so fundamentally different, so much more dangerous than other autonomous systems?
The sources cite numerous profound ethical objections that really go to the heart of human dignity, moral responsibility, and the laws of war. One is digital dehumanization. Allowing machines to make kill decisions reduces human beings, soldiers, and potentially civilians to mere data points, objects to be processed and eliminated based on sensor input and algorithms. It strips away human dignity. Another is the lack of meaningful human control. Delegating the irreversible decision to take a human life to a machine fundamentally undermines human moral agency and responsibility. It removes qualities like compassion, mercy, ethical judgment from the lethal decision loop. Then there's the unresolvable accountability gap we just discussed, but amplified to the highest degree. If a law system commits an unlawful killing, kills civilians, violates rules of engagement, who is legally and morally responsible, if no human made the direct decision, accountability evaporates.
That's a terrifying prospect in warfare.
Absolutely. Furthermore, there's the argument about the inability to make complex human judgments. Machines, however sophisticated, lack the uniquely human capacity to understand the inherent value of human life, to interpret the complex and context-dependent principles of international humanitarian law, like distinction and proportionality, or to make nuanced ethical judgments in the fog of war, and, chillingly, algorithmic bias with lethal consequences. The very same kinds of biases we find in civilian AI facial recognition failing on certain demographics, for example, could lead to autonomous weapons systems misidentifying targets and disproportionately killing people from certain ethnic groups or other populations.
Horrifying.
And finally, there are broader strategic concerns. Lowering the threshold to war, if you can send machines to fight without risking your own soldiers' lives, doesn't make going to war politically easier, and sparking a destabilizing new global arms race in autonomous weapons, potentially with catastrophic consequences.
Yeah. So listening to all that, the debate here isn't just about whether an AI can technically make a good targeting decision in some narrow sense. It seems to be about whether a machine should ever be allowed to make that kind of decision at all. Feels like we're debating the intrinsic value of human judgment versus algorithmic processing.
Exactly. That's precisely the point many sources make. The debate about laws really surfaces a deeper, more fundamental discussion about the intrinsic value of human judgment, human morality, and human control, especially when it comes to the use of lethal force. The strong opposition to laws is often rooted in the conviction that certain decisions, most acutely the decision to take a human life, require distinctly human qualities: empathy, moral responsibility, contextual understanding, the capacity for mercy that machines simply cannot possess now or perhaps ever. And this implies, for many, that there's a need for categorical prohibitions on certain types of AI applications, like fully autonomous weapons, not just risk-based assessments and regulations, but outright bans, because their very operation is seen as violating fundamental human values and dignity, regardless of their supposed efficiency.
Wow. Okay. What an incredible and at times sobering deep dive into this evolving complex world of AI ethics and bias. We've covered so much ground. We've seen how there's this surprising global consensus emerging on the core principles: fairness, accountability, transparency.
Right, the basics seem agreed upon.
Yet at the same time, a deep divergence, even conflict, in how those principles are actually being implemented and regulated across the globe. We've uncovered how bias isn't just some technical bug, but often a reflection, even an amplification, of systemic societal issues embedded in the data AI learns from.
A mirror, but sometimes a magnifying glass.
Exactly. And we've grappled with these profound new ethical challenges posed by generative AI misinformation, copyright battles, hallucinations, and by increasingly autonomous systems, pushing us to fundamentally rethink accountability, control, and the very limits of what we should delegate to machines, especially in areas like lethal force.
If we try to connect all this to the bigger picture, it's absolutely clear that AI ethics cannot be some static checklist or a one-time fix. It has to be an ongoing dynamic process, a constant process of inquiry, of dialogue, of adaptation, as the technology itself continues to evolve at such a rapid pace.
So after exploring all these sources, all these challenges and attempts at solutions, what does all of this mean for you listening right now? What can we do as individuals, as professionals, as citizens, as we navigate this rapidly changing landscape?
Well, our sources do offer some concrete, actionable recommendations aimed at different groups who all have a role to play. For policymakers, the call is really to embrace multi-stakeholder governance. Bring civil society, researchers, industry-affected communities to the table. Adopt a smart hybrid regulatory model, maybe combining legally binding baseline rules for high-risk areas with more agile, co-regulatory or standards-based approaches for others. Crucially, invest heavily in public AI literacy programs so citizens can engage meaningfully. And engage in proactive international diplomacy, especially on managing global catastrophic risks like autonomous weapons.
Okay, that's for the governments. What about industry?
For industry leaders in tech, the big message is move beyond just stating principles to demonstrating practical, verifiable implementation. Put your money where your mouth is. That means investing seriously in diverse teams and truly inclusive design processes from the start. Embrace radical transparency about your models, their beta, their limitations, and commit to robust, independent, third-party audits, especially for high-risk AI systems, rather than just relying on internal checks.
And for the research community?
For researchers, keep pushing the frontiers, but do it responsibly. Advance interdisciplinary collaboration, bring ethicists, social scientists, lawyers into the lab alongside the engineers. Develop more robust, practical, and usable mitigation tools like better XAI methods and fairness interventions. And critically, create new benchmarks and methodologies specifically designed to evaluate and mitigate the novel risks emerging from frontier systems, like generative AI hallucinations, or the potential for autonomous systems to behave unpredictably.
Ultimately, then, the goal isn't to slam the brakes on innovation, is it? It's not about stopping AI.
Not at all, according to these sources. It's about consciously, deliberately steering its trajectory. It's about shaping the development and deployment of this incredibly powerful technology toward a future that is more fair, more just, more equitable, and fundamentally aligned with our most cherished, enduring human values.
That's a powerful mandate.
It truly is. And it requires a sustained commitment from all segments of society, from government setting rules to companies building responsibly, to researchers innovating ethically, to citizens demanding accountability. We all need to engage in this critical, ongoing conversation. We need to hold technology and its creators accountable. And we need to collectively, consciously shape that algorithmic mirror in which we will increasingly see ourselves, our societies reflected.
The algorithmic mirror. That is a truly provocative thought for you to mull over. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. It's been incredibly insightful. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep exploring.